Hi, my name is Margaret Mary Bernadette Hauver Ferrara. I was born in 1945. Not a lot of information. It sounded scary. It sounded like we were going to have a war at sea, and it sounded like we were going to go into the Third World War.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was an event that caused fear to sweep across nations. The event started when the Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba by American spy planes. Soon after, the Kennedy administration put a blockade on Cuba to prevent further missiles from being built. After multiple letters were exchanged between the superpowers, an agreement to remove the missiles was made and the crisis ended. Were there any stories that you specifically remember at the time?
What was the most interesting, I think, were two stories that made this more vivid than just any other incident that would happen in history. The first was the night that the president came on and he talked about he was sending our U.S. ships to stop the Russians from bringing the parts or whatever to Cuba, and so he had a national broadcast on television. That's always frightening, or was more frightening in those days, because there was a lot of noise. There was a special little mark that went on in the TV screens, bulletin, and then there was this pause. And then he said how we were going to stop the Russians. This was a very serious action. It was leading up to war. And I was babysitting at the time down the street, probably about a block away from my house. And I sat there paralyzed with fear. It sounded so doggone scary. And I took the kids and I thought, well, I'd better push them in the stroller, I don't know where, back to our house and to be safe. Not that anybody had any fallout shelters in the town I lived in. And all of a sudden, the air raid siren went off in the town. It was this one we used because we lived in a very small town. It was one we used to let everybody know there was a serious fire, so that all the volunteer firemen would come and fight the fire. But to me, it was a sign that the world was ending. They were going to bomb at any minute. And I remember running with the two babies in that stroller to our house, crying the whole time, thinking that that was the end of the world, and at least I was going to try to save these two babies. And then found out that there actually was a local fire. That was my first memory. The next day, I went to school, and I went to a Catholic school, and we had sisters. I had sisters at St. Joseph, as a matter of fact. And Mother Superior came in. It was about 9:30 in the morning, so she was off schedule for her visit. And you could always tell when she came in, everything became very serious and sacred. And we all stood up, and good morning, Mother Superior. And she had us all sit down. She stood in the front of the room with the gravest voice I've ever seen. And she said, we are needing to pray for world peace. We are heading to World War III. And I need you all to get down on your knees and pray that we will be spared and that this crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, will somehow be averted and the Russians will turn back their ships. I remember for the rest of that day, all I did was shake. And I was extremely distracted, and all I wanted to do was go home. And then I realized that night that it appeared the crisis was over, that whatever we had done, of course, remember in those days, we were the good guys and the Russians were the bad guys, but what we had ever done made them turn around, and it looked like our prayer that morning made a difference, and we had averted World War III.
How were your parents affected by the Cuban Missile Crisis? Did they ever talk to you about it?
My mom was kind of this very calm person, which was nice because she had 6 children, and at that time, most of us were oblivious to much of anything, and I was very, very upset about this crisis. The rest of my family didn't seem to be too concerned. My dad was a newsman, and that was probably the most helpful. My dad took the time to explain to me what was going on, to say that it was more political than it was military, that it was two powers struggling, and that this would work out because it wasn't practical to go into war.
How was your view of the superpowers altered before and after the war?
I must admit, and I'm now that I teach social studies, I realize what it's like for students in high school. My perception at the time when this all began, before it began, and after it began for many years until I actually took the time to study what had happened, was the Russians were bad and the Americans were good, that we were the good guys. I knew nothing about the Bay of Pigs. I knew nothing about the other manipulations that we as the United States had done. I did not know why Russia was having conflicts with the United States. So I didn't even know that Russia had supported us in one of the world wars. So for most of that time until I went to college, there was nothing really taught in high school about Russia versus the United States. So we always sounded like the good guys. And it wasn't until afterwards that I realized that we had a lot of issues that we ourselves had done that we never owned up to the general public.
How long did the fear of the crisis last?
See, because that crisis was strangely covered, as I would say, in the news, I would say that I spent about a week being frightened. And for a long time after that, anytime I heard the air raid siren, I still thought the world was going to end. It was the happiest when I moved out of that little town and that silly air raid siren, because even till today when I go back, I still hear it and I still have this fear in my heart. But those that came from a time in World War II, we'd gotten an air raid siren in case we were going to ever be bombed. And people never thought twice about it, but as a kid, I always thought the world was ending. So how long did it take me for the Cuban Missile Crisis? I'd say about a week.
When you mentioned previously the news was strangely covered, what do you mean by that?
I mean, it was selectively covered. Now that I understand more about journalism and how press is, I realized how guarded it was at the time and how little information was given to the journalists who were trying to get information about the war. If you notice, a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis was not written until years after, when it was finally released. And part of it is because we played a role in what had happened in Cuba, and we didn't own up to it.
Waits at the window, wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door.